Two brothers trained under the same master in the same quiet Ionian village, and one of them killed the other. This is the complete account of Yasuo and Yone, how a bond that began in childhood came apart over a single accusation, and why death turned out to be nowhere near the end of their story. It is a story about wind and about swords, but underneath all of that, it is a story about two people who loved each other and lost each other in the worst possible way. One brother spent years wandering with a blade and no place to sheath it. The other crossed into the realm of the dead, refused to stay there, and came back wearing the face of the thing that tried to devour him. To understand how they ended up on opposite sides of a killing blow, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the land that shaped them both. Now, before we get into one of the most exciting lore, I need you to absolutely destroy that subscribe button until there's nothing there. Your support keeps me going from video to video. Ionia is one of the great regions of Runeterra, known in the Old Vastayan tongue as the First Lands. A vast archipelago of scattered settlements and unspoiled beauty where natural magic runs quietly through everything. Its people are spiritual by nature, and they seek to live in harmony and balance with the world around them, rather than bending it to their will. Ionian folklore is thick with spirits of every kind, benevolent guardians, mischievous tricksters, and jealous demons, all of them woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. For most of its long history, Ionia kept to itself, self-sufficient and largely neutral, while wars raged across the rest of the continent. Its people ask the spirits of tree and stone for permission before shaping their homes, and they venerate the great spirit trees that grow across the islands. In Ionia, the line between the world of the living and the world of spirits has always been thin, and the dead are never quite as far away as they seem. It is against this backdrop, in one small village tucked into this land of spirits and balance, that our story truly begins, with a widow raising a child alone. Their mother was already a widow, already caring for one young son, when a stranger came into her life. He arrived the way an autumn wind arrives, quietly and without warning, and he was gone again before the first Ionian winter settled over the little family. That second son was Yasuo. His father never stayed to see him grow, and the absence left a mark that the whole village seemed happy to keep pointing at. People in the village were not kind about it. On the gentler days, they spoke of Yasuo as an error in judgment, a mistake his mother had made. On the harder days, they called him something worse, a mistake that could never be undone. A child hears those words even when the adults think he cannot, and Yasuo grew up believing a good deal of it. The cruelty followed him around like weather. There was one person who never treated him that way. His older half-brother, Yone, stood between Yasuo and the rest of the world from the earliest days. Where Yasuo was loud, Yone was quiet. Where Yasuo acted first and thought later, Yone weighed everything with patience and care. Yone had lost his own father young, and that loss pressed him into the role of protector before he was really old enough for it. So when the other children circled and teased, Yone was the one who stepped in every single time. The two of them could not have been more different, and yet they were inseparable. Yone was cautious, conscientious, and bound by a sense of duty that ran through everything he did. Yasuo was impulsive and proud, quick to anger and quicker to act. And what he lacked in patience he made up for in a stubborn, burning determination. Somehow those two temperaments fit together. The steady older brother kept the reckless younger one from flying apart, and the reckless younger one gave the steady older one something to protect. When Yone was old enough, he began his apprenticeship at the village's renowned sword school, a place known across the region for the discipline of its training. Yasuo was not about to be left behind. He followed his brother to the gates and waited outside in the pouring monsoon rain, refusing to leave, until the teachers finally relented and let him in. That image says a great deal about him. The boy the village called a mistake stood in the rain until the people who did not want him had no choice but to open the door. Inside those walls, something became clear very quickly. Yasuo had a natural gift for the blade that most students spent their whole lives chasing. His talent came easily, and it made his fellow students bristle with envy. Because he seemed to reach without effort what they reached for with years of sweat. Yone, meanwhile, trained with 2 blades at once, and his skill with the dual swords earned him the genuine respect of everyone around him. The brothers were both remarkable in the training yard, in completely different ways. Yasuo's gift did not go unnoticed by the one person whose notice mattered most. Elder Suma, the last living master of the legendary wind technique, watched the young man train and saw something rare. The wind technique was not a common style. It was a nearly lost art, and Suma was the final keeper of it. When he offered to take Yasuo on as his personal student, it should have been the honor of a lifetime. Yasuo refused it. He was too proud and too restless to bow his head to a teacher, and he stayed unbridled, like a whirlwind with nothing to hold it in place. This is where his brother stepped in once more, not with force, but with a small gesture. Yone gave Yasuo a single maple seed. In the school, the maple seed carried a specific meaning. It was the highest lesson the place had to teach, a symbol of humility, a reminder that even the strongest thing grows from something small and patient. Yone was asking his brother, without a lecture, to set his arrogance down. The next morning, Yasuo accepted the position. He became Elder Suma's apprentice, and he took on the duty of the old man's personal bodyguard. Yonen had his own private doubts about the arrangement. He worried that Yasuo's impulsive nature would make him a difficult student, and he was not entirely sure the master had chosen wisely. Still, Soma was deeply respected and did not make careless decisions, so Yone kept his concerns to himself and let his brother find his own way. What followed was a good stretch of time, maybe the best the brothers ever shared. Yasuo learned the wind technique from its last master, and Yone continued to sharpen his own dual blade mastery. When the two of them sparred, wind against steel, it was a sight worth watching. Their matches drew a crowd, and more than that, the sessions were a real joy to the brothers themselves. For a while, everything the village had said about Yasuo seemed to be melting away in the face of what he was becoming. That peace did not last, because war came to Ionia. The Empire of Noxus invaded, and the fighting spread across the land. This was no small thing for a land like Ionia. For centuries, the First Lands had stayed out of the wars that tore across the rest of the continent, trusting in balance and harmony to keep them safe, and now that trust was being broken by an army that did not care for either. The invasion was a brutal, grinding occupation, and it forced a peaceful people to become something harder in order to survive. Whole settlements were destroyed. The war carved scars into the land and into the souls of the people who lived on it. Wounds that would not close for a very long time, and as the story goes on, you will see that those wounds mattered far more than anyone could have guessed at the time. Word reached the village of a great stand taken at the Placidium of Navori, and that story lit a fire in a lot of hearts. One by one, the able-bodied left to join the defense, until the village had given up nearly everyone who could hold a weapon. Yonen was among those who went. He and many of the other disciples marched off to defend Ionia against the Noxian advance. Yasuo wanted desperately to go with them. Every part of him longed to add his sword to the fight, and he could not stand the idea of staying behind while his brother and his classmates bled for their homeland. But Yasuo had a duty, and the duty was clear. He was ordered to remain and guard the elders, and above all to protect Elder Soma. Before Yone left, the brothers spoke one last time as the men they had been. Yasuo insisted he should be out there fighting, that his place was on the front line, and he swore he would not fail. Yone saw it differently. In his heart, he believed he was the one who had already failed his younger brother, that somewhere along the way he had not guided him well enough. Neither of them knew that this quiet disagreement would be the last real conversation they ever had, while both of them still drew breath. The invasion dragged on and became a full war. Then, one rain slicked night, the sound of a Noxian march rolled in from the next valley over. The drums were close enough to feel. Yasuo could not bear it any longer. Convinced that he could turn the tide of the battle single-handedly, he abandoned his post and slipped away toward the sound of the drums, leaving the elder unguarded behind him. He found no battle waiting for him. What he found instead was a raw grave in the earth, hundreds of Noxian and Ionian dead already lying where they had fallen. The fight long over before he ever arrived. There was no glory to be had, no tide to turn, nothing for his sword to do. The whole reckless gamble had been for nothing, and the cost of it was about to become clear. Sobered and hollow, Yasuo returned to the school the following day. He walked back through the gates expecting to face a scolding at worst. Instead, the remaining students surrounded him with their swords already drawn. Elder Soma was dead. And Soma had not simply died. He had been killed by the very wind technique he alone had mastered and taught, which meant only one person in the world could have done it. That person, as far as anyone knew, was Yasuo. He was the sole living practitioner of the wind technique, the master's own bodyguard, and he had vanished from his post on the night the master died. From the outside, there was no other reading of it. Yasuo stood accused not only of dereliction, of abandoning the man he was sworn to protect, but of murdering him with the very art he had been given. Yasuo knew the truth of it, that he had left his post, but had not raised a hand against his master. He also knew something colder. If he let himself be taken, the real killer would slip away and never answer for it, and the accusation against him would harden into permanent fact. So, he made a terrible choice. He fought his way free of the people he had trained beside, cutting a path out of the school, fully aware that running would look exactly like guilt to everyone watching. From that moment, Yasuo was a fugitive in a land already torn apart by war. He wandered war-scarred Ionia, searching for any thread that might lead him to the true murderer, and everywhere he went, his former allies hunted him. They came at him again and again, and each time he was forced to choose between his own death and theirs. He chose to live. Over those long, grinding months, it is likely he cut down the whole of his former school, winning every duel that was thrust upon him and hating each victory. Then came the one pursuer he dreaded above all others. His own brother, Yone, had joined the hunt. Yone carried a crushing weight of his own by this point, because he blamed himself for everything. If Yasuo truly had murdered Soma, then Yone had failed to teach his brother the righteous path. If Yasuo had merely abandoned his post and let the old man die, then Yone had failed to instill the discipline that would have kept him there. Either way, in Yone's mind, the fault traced back to him. He even blamed himself for the pursuers Yasuo had already been forced to kill. When Yone finally tracked his brother down, there was no shouting, no long speech. Bound by honor on both sides, the two of them circled each other in silence, blades ready, each knowing what was about to happen. Yone was determined not to fail Yasuo one more time, and to him that meant making his brother answer for the crimes laid at his feet. Their swords met. The duel was everything you would expect between two masters raised in the same yard, and it turned on a single advantage. Yone's dual blades were extraordinary, but Yasuo's command of the wind technique was something Yone could not fully match. In the end, the wind overcame the steel. With one flash of the blade, the outcast cut his own brother down, and the sword left a scar across Yasuo's face that he would carry for the rest of his days. Yone's final words were not a curse and not forgiveness. As his life slipped away, he spoke of the wind techniques that had killed Elder Soma, and of the plain fact that his brother was the only one who could have known them. In his last breath, he seemed to ask the question that would haunt Yasuo forever, which was simply why he had run at all. And then Yone fell silent and passed on, gone before he could offer any absolution, leaving that question hanging in the cold air between them. Now Yasuo had nothing. No master, no brother, no home he could return to. Only a name that all of Ionia spat when they said it. He drifted up into the mountains and drank away the pain of the war and the loss. A man who had become, in the truest sense, a sword without a sheath. He had all this deadly skill and nowhere to belong, nothing to protect, no reason to point the blade at anything. It was in that frozen, aimless stretch that he met someone who would change the direction of his grief. High in the snow, Yasuo crossed paths with a young Shuriman stone mage named Talia, who had fled the Noxian military and was far from home. In her, the wandering swordsman saw an unlikely student, and in himself he saw something even harder to believe, an unlikely teacher, the last thing a hunted killer expected to become. He began to train her, showing her how to shape stone the way he shaped wind, passing on the elemental principles that Elder Soma had once tried to pass on to him. There was a lesson buried in this that Yasuo only understood now that he stood on the other side of it. Teaching a swordsman to kill is a simple thing. The true difficulty lies in teaching him not to kill, and in guiding a young person toward restraint rather than fury. In helping Talia, Yasuo was finally, quietly, embracing everything his master had wanted for him. Talia gave him something to remember her by. She pulled a long thread from her hand-spun wool tunic and offered it to him, and from then on, he used it to tie his hair back. It was a small thing, a single thread, but it meant that someone in the world had chosen to leave a mark on him that was not a wound. For a man who had collected nothing but scars and accusations, that mattered more than it might seem. Their time together ended when the world shifted around them. Rumors spread of a risen god-emperor in Shurima, an ancient power returning to the desert. And Talia's path pulled her back toward her own people. The two of them parted ways in the mountains. Before she left, Yasuo gave her the maple seed, the very seed his brother Yone had once pressed into his hand as a lesson in humility. Its lesson had finally been learned, and now it was hers to carry. As Talia turned back toward the desert sands, Yasuo set his own course. He would go home, put right what he could, and find the person who had truly killed his master. The road home led Yasuo toward a suspicion that had been forming in his mind for a long time. During his years of wandering, he had crossed paths with a Noxian exile named Riven, and something about the way she moved and the way her blade cut had struck a chord in him. He recognized a technique, or the ghost of one, in the shattered sword she carried. The pieces began to line up in his thoughts, and he started to believe that this woman might be connected to the death of his master. The truth, when it finally came out, was more complicated and more tragic than a simple murder. Riven had once been a soldier of Noxus, and she carried a broken rune blade, a Noxian weapon of immense power that tied her to everything she was trying to leave behind. She wanted to be free of it. She wanted the blade destroyed, so that its hold on her would end for good. And she sought out someone with the power to break a weapon like that. That someone was Elder Suma. The old master agreed to help, and he turned the wind technique against the rune blade to shatter it completely. The technique worked, and the blade broke apart. But as it did, a stray shard of the weapon flew free and struck the elder, and that single shard killed him. It was an accident, a terrible one, and Riven carried the guilt of it in silence, the memory buried so deep that even she could barely face what had happened. The reckoning took place in the village council hall, where Riven, a Noxian woman still standing on Ionian soil, was brought before a hostile crowd to answer for herself. The mood in the room was against her from the start, and she could barely defend herself under the weight of the accusations. Then the priests brought out the evidence that would decide everything. They presented her broken rune sword, the pieces of the shattered Noxian weapon, and they had one piece more. A bone washer, one of those who tend to the remains of the dead, had recovered a metal fragment from among Elder Suma's bones. When that fragment was brought near the broken blade, it fit into place perfectly, the missing shard slotting back into the weapon it had come from. The instant the pieces joined, the sword released a wave of energy that flooded the entire hall with visions, terrible images of the war dead. All the pain and destruction the weapon had ever caused pouring out at once. Under the force of those visions, Riven could no longer keep the truth buried in her own mind. What her memory had been hiding rose to the surface, and she stood before the whole council and confessed aloud. She admitted that she had killed the elder. The words she spoke were plain and final, and with them the mystery that had ruined Yasuo's life for years was finally laid bare in front of everyone who had condemned him. There was a moment during all of this that showed exactly the kind of man Yasuo had become. To demonstrate what had happened, he focused the wind technique on Riven's sword the way Soma once would have. And history very nearly repeated itself, because the shard that had killed his master flew loose again and came within a breath of killing Asa Conte, the man Riven called her adoptive father. This time, though, Yasuo was there, and this time he was not too late. He caught the shard and stopped it before it could take another life, undoing in that instant the very kind of tragedy that had started all of it. After the confession, an old man named Asa visited Riven in her cell and offered her a way out. Ionia, in the end, showed her mercy. Because the death had been a genuine accident, she was spared the harshest punishment, made to perform community service instead, and through it she found her way toward the adoptive family who had taken her in. As for Yasuo, he held no grudge against Riven at all. He understood that she had never meant for any of it to happen, and he placed the blame squarely on himself, on the choice he had made to leave his post in the first place. So Yasuo was cleared. The murder he had been hunted for across all of Ionia was revealed as an accident, and the accusation that had defined his entire adult life was finally lifted. You might think that would be the end of his suffering, but it was not. Across Ionia, he is still known as the man who killed his master, the truth of the trial never quite catching up to the reputation that had spread for years. A name, once ruined, does not always heal just because the facts change. And there was a deeper wound that no verdict could touch. Yasuo could accept that he had not murdered Soma, but he could not forgive himself for abandoning him, and he certainly could not forgive himself for what that choice had led to. Every step of the tragedy traced back to the night he walked away from his duty. If he had stayed, Soma might have lived. If Suma had lived, there would have been no accusation. And if there had been no accusation, his brother Yone would still be alive. That chain of consequences sat on his chest and would not lift. Here the story leaves Yasuo for a while, because the man he killed did not simply vanish into the dark. For Yone, death was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something none of them could have imagined. When Yone died on his brother's blade, he opened his eyes in the spirit realm, the world that lies just beneath and behind our own. At first, a spirit fox came to guide him, the way the newly dead are often guided, leading souls toward the peace that usually waits for them on the other side. For most people, that is how it goes. The spirit realm receives them, and in time, they find rest. Yone found no rest at all. The spirit realm is a strange place to be caught. It sits alongside the physical world like a parallel pocket of existence, close but separate, and the living can only cross into it in death or through great spiritual power. Time and space do not behave there the way they do among the living. The Ionians picture their own version of the afterlife through an old myth called the Path, a road the dead are meant to walk toward peace, guided gently onward until they let go of the world behind them. Yone had stepped onto that road. He simply could not bring himself to follow it to the end. The weight of his failure came down on him the moment he arrived. All that honor, all that rigid duty he had built his life around, and it had ended with his own brother's steel in his body, and his master lying unmourned. Something in him broke under it. The patient, disciplined man who had spent decades tempering his every feeling finally cracked, and the rage he had held back his whole life came pouring out. He pounded his fists against the ground in fury, and a low, rumbling laugh answered him from the dark. Standing before him was a monstrous humanoid spirit gripping a blood-red blade. This was an Azakana, and it was no ordinary creature. It was a powerful one, a predatory thing that had been stalking Yone from beyond the veil for a long time, feeding quietly on all the doubt and self-hatred he had carried while he hunted his brother. It had wanted to devour him in life, but he had died before it could strike, and now that his soul had crossed over, the Azakana saw its chance and took it. Without a word, it attacked. Yone met the assault the only way he knew how. He drew the spiritual echoes of the twin blades he had wielded in life, calling them to his side just in time to block the strike, and for a moment his swordsmanship shone the way it always had. His skill in the duel was unmatched. But skill was not enough against this enemy, because the Azakana fought with magic, and that magic began to overwhelm him. He was losing, and he could feel it. Then, the last of his restraint gave way. In one furious burst, with a lifetime of held-back anger behind it, Yone wrested the blood-red blade out of the creature's grip and ran the Azakana through with its own weapon. The thing died. But even as darkness closed over him once more, the last sound he heard was that same rumbling laugh, as though the Azakana had somehow won the very thing it wanted by losing the fight. That laughter should have been a warning. When Yone awoke again, he was back in the material realm, but it was not the world he remembered. Everything looked like a grim reflection of itself, the colors dimmed and washed out, the spirit realm hanging so close he could almost taste it at the edge of every breath. He struggled to his feet with the blood-red sword still in his hand, the weapon he had torn from the demon now his to keep. And there was something on his face. A mask had formed over his features while he was gone, shaped in the exact likeness of the Azakana he had killed, gripping his face like a parasite carved from bone and hatred. He could not pull it off. It would not come away, no matter what he did, fused to him as though it had always been part of him. Worse, through the eyes of that mask, he could now see things that had been invisible to him before. All around, at the frayed edges of reality, he could make out the shapes of other Azakana, lurking and waiting. This was Yone's introduction to what these creatures truly were. Azakana are minor demons, the weaker cousins of the great demons of Runeterra, like Evelyn and Tam Kench. The powerful ones embody enormous primal drives, things like desire and addiction, but Azakana are smaller and more personal than that. Each one is the shape of a single private feeling, the kind that eats at a person from the inside. One might be gnawing self-doubt. Another might be the fear of being forgotten. They are quiet at first, content to feed on a person's negativity, growing slowly, dreaming their way toward existence until the day they finally manifest and devour the host who fed them. The name itself tells you what they are. Azakana comes from the old Ionian words Aza, meaning little, and Akana, meaning demon, so the word means, quite simply, little demon. That smallness is the whole point of them. A great demon like Fiddlesticks, the first and oldest of the demonic entities said to have existed since the first screams of creation, feeds on fear in the broadest possible sense, a vast and bottomless hunger. An Azakana cannot do that. It can only feed on one narrow, specific version of a feeling, a single fear rather than fear itself, the dread of being forgotten rather than dread as a whole. It locks onto one person's particular weakness and drinks from it, and only from it. If the Azakana grows strong enough on that one feeling, it can bloom into a full demon in its own right, or abandon a used-up host and drift toward another whose pain has a richer flavor. This is the quiet, patient horror of them. The way they turn a person's own private suffering into food. There was a reason Azakana were spreading across Ionia in such numbers just then, and it circles back to the war. When Noxus invaded, countless Ionians died, and many of them were never properly buried, their bodies left on battlefields that had not yet been cleansed or mourned. The living carried grief and rage that the peaceful old Ionia had never taught them how to hold. Instead of harmony and balance, the land was suddenly full of sorrow and anger, and that flood of raw negative emotion was exactly what Azakana feed upon. So they came, drawn to the wound the war had left, multiplying in the shadows until the balance between the living world and the spirit world began to tip. The Kinku Order, the secret keepers of that balance, worked to expel them. But there were only so many hands for so many demons. Ionia was, in a very real sense, becoming a land of little demons, and almost no one was equipped to stop it. Yoan also learned that these creatures were not invincible. There was a way to stop them, and it did not always require a blade. If he could discover an Azakana's true name, learning the exact nature of the feeling it was made from, he could force it into dormancy. The creature would collapse into an inert mask, a lifeless object that simply embodied that one twisted emotion and could no longer harm anyone. Naming the thing was, in a sense, more powerful than fighting it. One question troubled Yone more than any other in those first strange days. He needed to know whether the demon whose mask he wore had taken hold of him, whether he was still himself. The answer, as far as he could tell, was that he was not possessed. The Azakana held no sway over his mind or his will. This set him apart from others in Runeterra who carry a demon within them, figures like Rast and the young assassin Cain, whose bodies are a constant struggle between two occupants. There was no such war inside Yone. The mask was on him, but it was not steering him. That did not mean he had escaped unchanged. He was not a walking corpse either, not undead in the ordinary sense, but something rarer and harder to name. And he had gained real power from the ordeal. Yoan found that he could tear his own soul free of his body, leaving his mortal form behind and moving through the world as a spirit for a short time. In that form he could travel where flesh could not, slip into the spirit realm, and strike directly at things that no living blade could touch. What the Azakana had meant as a curse had also handed him the exact tools he would need to hunt its kind. So that is what Yone chose to do, uncertain why he had not been allowed to simply die, and unsettled by the mask that would not leave his face. He set out to hunt Azakana wherever he could find them. Part of it was a search for understanding, a need to learn what he had become and why. Part of it was more urgent than that. He wanted to discover the true name of his own Azakana, the one riding his face. Because until he did, he could never be sure if or when it might wake up and finally consume him. Every mask he unraveled brought him a little closer to understanding the one he could not take off. The man who walked out of the spirit realm looked nothing like the disciplined disciple who had entered it. In life, Yone had been a tall young man in fine Ionian robes. His dark hair tied neatly back, carrying himself with the composure of someone who valued order above all. Death rewrote him. Now his clothing hung torn and bloodstained, and he wore no shirt at all, his chest and shoulders wrapped in bandages that marked the mortal wound his brother had given him. His hair fell loose and long. His eyes glowed a cold, ghostly blue behind the scarlet mask that could never come off. His body became a kind of grim record of his work. As he hunted and defeated Azakana one by one, sealing them into their inert masks, he began to carry those masks with him, fixing them to his belt and his robes. Each pale mask on his body was a feeling he had named and silenced, a fear or a doubt or a private grief given a face, and then quieted forever. He also carried 2 swords now, and he used them for different purposes. One was a blade of steel, for the battles he still had to fight against mortal men. The other was the Azakana blade, the blood-red weapon he had taken in the spirit realm, meant for the spirits and demons that ordinary steel could not harm. In this, Yone walks a path much like another Ionian, the Eye of Twilight known as Shen, who also keeps separate blades for the living and the dead. It is a fitting comparison. Shen leads the Kinko Order, the Hidden Keepers sworn to protect the fragile balance between the physical world and the spirit world, and it was the Kinko who tried to hold back the flood of Azakana after the war left Ionia so wounded. There were never enough of them for the work. Yonen, in his strange new life, took up that same burden almost entirely alone. A single hunter, walking the line between 2 realms that most people are lucky enough to never think about. Both men answer to duties the ordinary world does not see, and both pay for it with a kind of endless solitude. When Yone separates his soul from his body, that spirit form appears much as he does in the flesh, only semi-transparent and wrapped in a bright, burning scarlet. A ghost of a man doing the work the living cannot do. There is one encounter that captures what Yone's new life is really like. On a moonlit road, a young boy came running through the mist, driven by a terror he could not name, a creeping dread that had wrapped itself around him like a second skin. In his panic, he ran straight into a bare-chested swordsman whose waist was ringed with pale, anguished masks. The boy looked up into a cold gaze behind a broken demon mask and must have thought he had found something even worse than what he was fleeing. But Yone's attention was not on the boy. It was on the shape hovering in the fog behind him, an Azakana that had been drawn to the child's self-loathing, feeding on it, growing. The warning Yone gave was not a threat. It was a rescue. The thing in the fog looked at first like nothing more than drifting mist, but beneath that soft shape was a hideous beast, and it had been fattening itself on the boy's sadness for who knows how long. Yone hunted it, learned what it was, and sealed it away, and the child walked home lighter than he had come. That is how most of Yone's nights go now. He arrives looking like a monster, and more often than not the monster he arrives to fight is standing just behind the frightened person who mistook him for the danger. Over time, Yone came to understand the spirit realm and his place between the worlds. He described it as a strange mirror of our own, an inverse of everything familiar. He let go of the ideas of fate and destiny that once might have comforted him, and came to believe there was no grand design waiting to be revealed, only tomorrow and the work it would bring. He learned a hard truth about the mask as well, that if you wear one long enough, you begin to forget the face underneath it. And he came to see how Azakana trap their victims. How doubt breeds more doubt and fear breeds more fear. Until a person is caught in a closed loop of their own worst feelings while the demon feeds and grows fat on it. Long before blades and sorcery are needed, he found, the right words can save a soul from that trap. All the while, the shadow of his brother hung over him. Yone's own past and his unresolved conflict with Yasuo had not disappeared, but they had been pushed into the background by this larger and stranger threat that now defined his existence. For Yone, the brother who had killed him had become just one thread in a much wider tapestry of corruption bleeding between the realms. He had bigger concerns than revenge, and less time for it than ever. And yet the two of them were not finished with each other, because their paths were about to cross one more time. That crossing happened at Whale during the Spirit Blossom Festival. The festival is a sacred time in Ionia, when the veil between the living world and the spirit realm grows thin, and the rites of the season are meant to heal wounded souls and help the grieving find some measure of peace. The Spirit Blossom Festival is one of the oldest and most cherished traditions in all of Ionia. During it, the door between the two worlds is said to open, so that the dead may return to their loved ones and spirits of every kind turn their eyes toward the living. It is a time of remembrance, of forgiveness, and of transition, marked by the blossoming of the delicate spirit blossoms that give the festival its name. The mood of it is deliberately hard to pin down, neither fully joyful nor fully solemn, because the spirits who cross over during those days are themselves a mixture of the gentle and the dangerous. Some come to guide, others come to deceive. Each one carries a story for anyone willing to listen. And this particular festival fell soon after the war, at the very moment when unburied dead and unhealed grief had drawn Azakana into Ionia in greater numbers than anyone could remember. Which meant the thinning veil let far more than kindly spirits through. The festival at Whale takes place along a small river of the same name, whose banks come alive with blooming spirit blossoms when the season arrives. Shrines and titanic statues stand scattered across those banks, silent stone watchers over the rites of the living and the dead. It is a beautiful place, and it was here, among the blossoms and the shrines and the thinning veil, that the two brothers would finally meet again. Yasuo came to Whale, holding very little hope that any ritual could ease what he carried. He had killed his brother and buried his master through his own failure, and a festival was not going to lift that. Still, he went. What waited for him at Whale was not peace, but a predator. And Azakana had fixed on Yasuo, drawn to the storm of pain and regret swirling inside him. And it meant to devour him whole. To move unnoticed among the festival crowds, the creature had taken a human disguise, cloaking itself in the robes of a green-glade elder, so that it looked like nothing more than a kindly old monk. Yasuo's heart was exactly the kind of feast these demons hunger for. All that guilt and unresolved sorrow laid open like a wound, and the Azakana closed in to take it. Before it could, a masked figure cut through the creature with swift and righteous fury, striking it down before Yasuo fully understood what was happening. Yasuo turned to see who had saved him, and the shock must have hit him like a physical blow. Behind the demon mask, changed by death yet unmistakable, stood Yone. His brother had come back. The man he had killed with his own hands, whose dying question had haunted him for years, was standing in front of him alive in some strange new form. Yasuo did the thing that his guilt demanded. He fully expected a reckoning, and he was ready to accept it. He offered his brother the chance to take vengeance, to finish what the duel had started, to make him pay in blood for the life he had taken. If any man in Runeterra had earned the right to kill Yasuo, it was Yone, and Yasuo did not run from that. He stood and offered his life to the brother he had wronged. Yone did not take it. His answer was quiet, and it was strange, and it carried the whole weight of everything that had passed between them. Yasuo might well deserve death, Yone told him, but it would not come from Yone. The older brother had let go of that particular claim on his brother's life somewhere along the way, in the spirit realm or in the long hunt afterward. To help Yasuo understand who was really standing before him, Yone fell into a familiar crossed sword stance, a pose from their years of sparring together, and in that instant of recognition, the shock finally settled into something like belief. There was still an Azakana to deal with, and this last stretch of the reunion asked something of Yasuo that no fight ever had. The demon fed on his regret, which meant that as long as Yasuo clung to his guilt, he was feeding the very thing trying to eat him. He had to let go of his past, at least enough to loosen the creature's grip, and only then could the brothers put it down for good. In some tellings they struck it down together, wind and steel and spirit finally on the same side after all the years of pointing their blades at each other. The thing that had come to devour Yasuo was destroyed. When it was over, the brothers did not fall into each other's arms, and they did not go their separate ways as enemies either. What passed between them was quieter and more honest than either of those. Yasuo said plainly that Ionia had nothing left for him, that whatever home he had once had was gone. Yone gave him a blessing that sounded almost like a farewell and almost like a hope. Even the wind has a path, he told his brother, and he wished for the spirit of Ionia to guide him wherever that path led. Then they parted, in a peace that felt real even though so much between them was still unspoken. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that reunion actually resolved, and what it left open, because the story is careful not to tie everything into a neat bow. Yasuo let go of enough of his past to survive the Azakana, but letting go for a moment is not the same as being free. And Yone stayed his hand, but staying his hand is not the same as forgiveness. Whether Yone has truly forgiven his brother, or whether Yasuo has ever managed to forgive himself, is left deliberately unanswered. The two of them walked away from Whaley with the killing blow behind them, and a great deal still unspoken between them. That unfinished quality is the heart of who these two men are, and you can hear it in the names the world has given them. Yasuo is the unforgiven. Yone is the unforgotten. Say those two words together and you have the whole tragedy in miniature. One brother cannot be forgiven, not by Ionia and not by himself, no matter how many times the truth is spoken aloud. The other cannot be forgotten, cannot fade into the peaceful rest that death was supposed to bring, held in the world by a mask he never asked for. Neither one gets to lay his burden down, neither one gets to rest. The parallels run deeper than the titles. Both brothers ended up wandering, cut loose from the home and the school that had shaped them. Both became teachers of a kind in their new lives, one guiding a young stone mage toward restraint, the other guiding frightened souls away from the demons feeding on their fear. Both carry a weapon that separates them from ordinary people, Yasuo with the last living wind technique, and Yone with a blade stolen from the dead, and both are defined, above everything else, by a single night when the wrong choice was made and could never be taken back. They are mirror images of the same grief, each reflecting the other across the boundary between the living and the dead. There is a gentle irony in the fact that the lesson at the center of their whole story is the maple seed. Humility, Yone gave it to Yasuo when they were young, asking him to set his pride aside, and Yasuo could not fully learn it until he had lost nearly everything. He passed it on to Talia only after his wandering had finally taught him what it meant. The seed travelled from brother to student, carrying the same quiet message the whole way: that the greatest things grow slowly and from the smallest and most patient beginnings. It is a soft idea at the core of a very hard story. As for where the brothers stand now, their paths continue to unfold across Runeterra, no longer pointed at each other, but not exactly together either. Yone walks his endless hunt, and along the way he has crossed paths with a gentle dream spirit, the fawn named Lilia, whom he has come to watch over. His protectiveness of her echoes the bond Yasuo once shared with Talia, the hardened warrior and the innocent young soul, the teacher and the student. Even a man wearing a demon's mask, it seems, cannot fully let go of the instinct to shield the vulnerable. The same instinct that made Yone step between a young Yasuo and the cruel words of the village all those years ago. Yasuo, meanwhile, has found his way back toward the land that once cast him out, when Noxus invaded Ionia a second time, and the warrior Aurelia called for help to defend a seaside village against the Noxian army. The answer came from a handful of Ionia's most formidable defenders. Akali came, Karma came, the tiny storm wielder Kennen came, and Yasuo came too, the man whose name Ionia still spits, arriving to fight for a homeland that has never quite taken him back. His sword found a cause again, at least for a while, which is perhaps the closest thing to peace a man like him can hope for. Riven, whose broken blade set the whole tragedy in motion, found a measure of grace as well. Because Elder Soma's death was a true accident and not a murder, Ionia showed her mercy rather than vengeance. She was given community service instead of a harsher sentence, and through that path she grew closer to the adoptive family that had taken her in, including the old man who had freed her from her cell. It is a small mercy in a story with very few of them, and it is worth noting that the man most wronged by that accident, Yasuo himself, never held it against her. He carried the blame inward instead, where it had always lived. Step back from the whole thing, and a shape emerges. This is a story about duty and the terrible cost of a single lapse in it. Yasuo left his post for one night, believing he could do more good on the battlefield, and that one choice unspooled into the deaths of his master, his classmates, and his own brother. It is a story about how the truth, once it is buried under enough fear and enough certainty, can take years to claw its way back into the light, and how it sometimes arrives too late to undo the damage it might have prevented. And it is a story about grief that outlasts death itself, about two brothers who could not rest, even when rest was all they had left to want. Now, everything you have heard so far is the tale as it exists inside the world of Runeterra, but there is a second story worth telling, and that is the story of how these two characters came to be in the real world. Because Yasuo and Yone are champions in League of Legends, one of the most played games ever made, and the way they arrived tells you something about why they resonate with so many people. Yasuo came first, by a long stretch. He was released on the 13th of December in 2013, the 117th champion added to the game. From almost the moment he arrived, he became one of the most popular and most divisive characters in the entire roster. Beloved by the players who mastered his wind, and cursed by the teammates who watched him struggle. His combination of high skill and high reward made him a fixture of the game, and his tragic backstory as the wrongly accused swordsman gave that flashy fighting style an emotional weight underneath it. Yone did not arrive until nearly 7 years later, on the 6th of August in 2020, as the 150th champion in the game. He came into the world during a large in-game event called the Spirit Blossom Festival, the same festival that features in the Brothers' reunion, which was no accident. Interestingly, Yone actually made his first appearance not in League of Legends itself, but in the card game Legends of Runeterra, stepping into that world before he ever set foot on the main battlefield. His arrival had been anticipated for a long time by players who knew the lore, because anyone familiar with Yasuo's story knew that somewhere out there was a brother who had died on his blade. The reason Yone exists at all, from a design standpoint, is a curious one. Yasuo had become so overwhelmingly popular that he was picked in an enormous share of games. And the developers wanted to give players who loved his style another option to spread that popularity across. One of the designers, who goes by the name Endless Pillows, explained that the original idea was for Yone to be almost an echo of Yasuo. A similar fighter meant in part to lower Yasuo's very high pick rate. It sounds strange to build a whole new character partly to make an existing one less crowded, and the designer admitted as much. But the reasoning was that it would be healthier for the game overall. What began as a practical design goal turned into one of the most emotionally resonant champion releases the game had produced. The way Yone was introduced to players leaned entirely into that emotional weight. Riot Games released an animated short called The Path, an Ionian myth, which followed Yasuo's brother through a dreamlike spirit world, chasing a fox, witnessing tortured souls turn to stone, and finally being seized by the very demon he was trying to fight. There was also a trailer titled Kin of the Stained Blade, which carried the tagline that would come to define him, that even the wind has a path. When the path first appeared, many fans actually suspected that Yone would return as a Darkin, one of the game's ancient sword-bound warriors, before the truth of the Azakana was revealed. That misdirection only made the eventual reveal land harder. The look of the character was a deliberate choice too. The artists could have brought Yone back dressed in his fine Ionian robes, unchanged from life, but that did not feel right for a man who had gone through such a traumatic death. So they gave him the bandages and the bare chest, visible proof that he had been mortally wounded and had come back as something altered. As one of the artists put it, after his death and everything he faced in the spirit realm, Yone had changed a great deal, and his appearance needed to show it. The contrast between the two brothers, the wind-swept outcast and the masked hunter, was built into their designs on purpose, so that a single glance could tell you these were two versions of the same tragedy. There is even a small, lovely detail hidden in the game itself for players who know to look for it. Yasuo, when left standing still, plays a mournful tune on a flute, a melody that always sounded a little incomplete on its own. When Yone joined the game, the two brothers gained a shared moment, if both champions perform their idol gesture at the same time. Yasuo plays his flute while Yone draws out a stringed instrument, and together the two of them produce a full melancholy song. The older brother's music completes the younger brother's, the way it once did in the training yard, wind and steel, and now sound finally in harmony. Yasuo's lonely flute had been waiting for its other half for 7 years. Yasuo's story has even reached beyond League of Legends itself. He appears in Riot's fighting game as well, carrying his tragedy to new audiences who may never have played the original game, which speaks to how deeply his character struck a chord. A wrongly accused swordsman, a brother killed by mistake, a truth that comes too late. These are old and human ideas. And dressing them in wind magic and demon masks did not make them any less human. That is why the story travels. So we come back around to where we started, to two brothers who trained under the same master and ended up on opposite ends of a killing blow. Everything that happened afterward flowed from that one night and that one choice: the murdered master, the false accusation. The years of exile, the fated duel, and the strange second life that death refused to grant peacefully. Yasuo carries a name that cannot be forgiven, wandering a homeland that will not fully claim him, blaming himself for a chain of events that began the moment he walked away from his post. Yone carries a mask that cannot be removed, hunting demons across the realms, unable to rest, unable quite to forgive, and unable quite to be forgotten. And in the end, the most honest thing about their story is what it refuses to resolve. They did not fully reconcile. They did not part as enemies. Yasuo offered his life, and Yone declined to take it, and the two of them walked away from that festival carrying the same grief they had always carried. Only now they carried it, knowing the other one was still out there. Even the wind has a path, Yone told his brother, and maybe that is the closest thing to comfort this story is willing to offer. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, just the quiet faith that even the most restless things are moving towards something, and that a path, however long and however lonely, still leads somewhere. Rest easy, and let the wind carry you there.